move on to our second panel now, and the moderator for this panel is Byron Pitts, the co-anchor of ABC News Nightline and the chief national correspondent. He has covered national news stories and in-depth features for the network, reporting across the news division, including Good Morning America, World News Tonight with David Muir this week and 2020. Pitts is a multiple Emmy Award-winning journalist and news veteran with over 20 years of experience, known for his thoughtful storytelling, on-the-ground reporting, and in-depth interviews. And our panelists are Dr. Joe Selby, the Executive Director of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, Dr. Mark McClellan, the Robert J. Margolis Professor of Business, Medicine, and Policy and Director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University, and has, as been mentioned, former commissioner of the FDA. Nancy Brown, the CEO of the American Heart Association, Dr. Victor Dzau, the president of the National Academy of Medicine, Dr. Joel Beetsch, vice president of Global Patient Advocacy at Celgene, and Scott Whitaker, president and CEO of AdvaMed. Thank you, and over to you, Byron.
Great, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Our ground rules, we're going to talk amongst ourselves for about 20 minutes or so, and we'll open up sooner to questions. My primary job this afternoon is keeper of the time, so no sermons, please. Just quick Bible verses and your questions, so we can get as many questions as possible. And so, Joe, I'd like to start with you. We just heard from the previous panel, challenges and potential solutions to the opioid crisis. Tell us how your organization is addressing this epidemic with research, and how would you describe the type of research the institution funds?
Sure. Well, if I might just say thank you to Research America for the invitation to participate in the panel, and that was a fabulous panel, I thought, so happy to respond. PCORI was set up to do the kind of research the governor was talking about research on what works, and particularly comparative, in a comparative approach, what works for whom, and particularly in real-world settings. So we ask and answer practical questions in a comparative fashion in real-world settings. So, and we do it because we're set up to serve the information needs of patients and clinicians, policymakers, health plans. So we start by listening to stakeholders, and about 2.5 years ago, it became very clear that patients and clinicians in particular, payers as well, were asking us to support research on what works in the management of both chronic pain and opioids. So we now have a portfolio of 11 major projects. It's a targeted topic, 11 major projects, about $65 million in investment. We have more awards being made later this month, and we have 2 open announcements, one about medication-assisted therapy in pregnancy, and a second one, a reopening of an initiative on prevention. So our research covers the spectrum. We take a pretty holistic approach from preventing the initiation of opioid use in the emergency room or dental office or other places, to managing patients with chronic pain who are using opioids, to particularly reducing the use of high-dose and risky dose opioids, to managing addiction. So, okay, just we do the research in settings from the VA to Medicaid programs to federally qualified health centers to prisons to integrated delivery systems, because the research has to be done in the real world. And I would say that we're examining everything from medication-assisted therapy to non-pharmacologic therapies to decision support for patients, decision support for clinicians. Yeah.
We're going to live in our conversation in 3 areas: landscape, from each of you, challenges, the future, and then we'll open up. So this next question is for Joel and Scott. You guys can tackle this one. And the other panelists, please feel free to weigh in if you choose to. Now, gentlemen, how do you integrate the patient voice into the research and development, and what is on your wish list to help accelerate R&D process?
Sure. So from the biopharmaceutical sector, I think I speak for many of my colleagues in the room. Many of us have several different approaches to how we include that patient voice. I have the pleasure of leading the patient-focused efforts at my company but work very closely with the sort of ecosystem on all of this. And I'll talk about three different ways, and maybe I'll let my colleague talk, and we'll talk about wishes as well. So the first way we do this at my company and many others is continuing to look across the entire life cycle of a particular product or a therapy in development to determine where there are places to put that patient voice into the R&D process. Everywhere from natural history evaluation all the way out to post-marketing data evaluation. So the entire spectrum. That's number one. Number two is we've started at Celgene, and many other companies have this as well, is a patient-focused center of excellence within our R&D organization, of which I'm a strong contributor to, where we're looking at all kinds of analytics to evaluate the clinical trial patient burden index, or the complexity of a particular clinical trial. How much regulatory input do we need? What does it mean for a patient to be in a clinical trial? Will they stay in that clinical trial? So lots of data, and we talked about data in the first panel, lots of data and data analytics. And the third way, and many of my colleagues are here in the room, is we work together as a stakeholder group with industry, other study sponsors, and academia, with patients and patient advocates to build infrastructure around how we can incorporate that patient voice into trials. The Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative finally got their paper published, but we just put out kind of a guidebook on how to do it.
Very similar story from the device perspective, and I won't repeat what was already said, but the one thing I would add, one of the things we're trying to do is have patients begin to tell the story for us about how devices and new technologies have changed their lives. I think of the previous panel and the opioid addiction conversation we were having. I told a story recently about a young veteran who served in Afghanistan, hurt his back terribly badly, was on opioids for 2 or 3 years, debilitated, sort of ruined his life. And then he found a new technology that one of our companies produced, which eliminated the pain. It was a device that eliminated the pain and allowed him to get back to living a normal life. Having him tell that story is more powerful many times than us telling that story for him. Opioids almost destroyed his life. A device changed his life. And as we tell that to both regulators, to payers, and also to members of Congress, it changes the way you think about the patient perspective, not just from a company's perspective, but the impact it has on an individual's life. And that's been a very important part of what we do.
Thank you, gentlemen. Nancy, how does the American Heart Association leverage patient data and technology in cardiovascular disease research to improve prevention and treatment?
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you again to Research America for this wonderful and inspirational afternoon. You know, we've been very focused for about 15 years on very methodically collecting patient data back when we created and launched our program called Get With the Guidelines that now is in 2,300 U.S. hospitals. And the purpose of that program at the time it was launched was to improve adherence to guidelines. So the AHA and our colleagues at the American College of Cardiology for decades have created evidence-based clinical practice guidelines that were not being implemented in a robust fashion at the point of care. And so we created this decision support tool that captured patient data, allowed us to look at trends in hospitals, and we've used that data actually in whole to look at improvements in healthcare, improvement in healthcare disparities in over 400 published manuscripts. And so that's been an important aspect of using patient data. But more recently, we've been focused on individual patients who want to contribute all kinds of data, from genetic data to lifestyle data to sensor data, through our Institute for Precision Medicine, where we've created this robust data platform to allow this data to be captured and used for scientific research and for value to be given back to patients who donate data.
Victor, to you. Thank you, madam. Victor, to you, sir. Is medical discovery itself able to speed up medical process? And tell us about gene editing and how does it fit into the future of medical progress?
You heard earlier, by the way, thank you, Mary, for putting this together, and Patrick, you were just terrific. And it does say one thing from my perspective: we're moving too slowly. When we talk about clinical research, we're moving too slowly. If you look at the average time taken to get a new pain medication that's non-addictive the clinical trials is needed. We know that the huge amount of dollars needed for clinical trial. I think the Tufts Center for Drug Evaluation Development says about $2.6 billion just for the development piece alone. Clinical trials, $1.6 billion per drug. And so you can imagine that unless we overcome these issues, it's not going to be, so I'm really glad to hear Scott Gottlieb talking about modernizing FDA, moving things, and you and all of us talking about how to use data, adaptive trial, et cetera. So my feeling is, when you heard earlier speaker, Michael talk about how all this technology is now close. Yes, I think so. Gene editing is a great example. CRISPR-Cas9 being one of them, being able to precisely change a gene. And certainly it's already now used in somatic therapy in a big way, therapeutically, still experimental. And of course, germline therapy, we struggle mightily at the National Academy to say, should we move forward or not? So I think technology in terms of science discovery is moving really quickly. What we're falling behind is, in fact, the taking from the preclinical all the way to adoption in practice. That's where I think we need a lot of push, a lot of change, moving way too slowly. You heard earlier about maybe we need to think about different way of using data. First, different trial design, adaptive trial, right? Bayesian methodology to look at new ways to look at taking data together from different early trial to the pivotal trial, move faster. You heard about the idea of maybe using technology, and we've been talking for a long time. How do you integrate clinical database with clinical research so that we don't have to rediscover every time you enroll a patient? And I'll tell you a little bit later, perhaps, about some of the innovation that's been going on elsewhere that shows that you can actually quickly accelerate trials at a much lower cost if we can really get integration of data, sharing data infrastructure, and new design ways of doing things, and certainly ways by which we reduce administration. Being at Duke, I remember how long it takes to get a contract done, right? and how long it takes, in fact, to get the first patient enrolled. And so I think so my answer to your question is, I think science and technology are moving at a rapid pace. We got to apply them to the last mile, which in fact is right now the clinical research development, which is slowing everything down and is costly as hell.
Thank you, sir. And Mark, what health system reforms do you recommend to help get treatments to patients in a safe and timely fashion?
Well, I think the solution's there in the same direction as you've just been hearing for the rest of the panel, and I too am very glad to be part of Research America's efforts in this area. To say it's much easier being on the afternoon panel than the FDA commissioner slot. One of the things that Research America has been emphasizing in the format for this meeting and the work going forward is the need to think about research broadly. So it's not just the basic clinical research and kinds of things that kind of go along with NIH funding, important and critical as that is, important as that part of Research America's mission is, but really, as Victor was saying, taking it kind of the last mile, and boy, it seems like a lot more than a mile to get these discoveries turned into products that can be produced reliably, used effectively. And you heard a lot today about changes in delivery systems that are needed. There is work going on to try to shift the focus from the paying and use of individual products to really meeting a particular patient's needs. A patient is not just someone with pain or someone who gets a procedure, but a whole constellation of genetic predispositions, behavioral and environmental influences, preferences that influence increasingly what their treatment should involve. And we are not doing a very good job of aligning all these discoveries that are coming through the process, either in the development process of knowing which treatment is going to work best in which patients, where real-world evidence and like can help, or in the utilization process. So still a lot of work to do there, and a big need for research on what works in getting the right treatment to the right patient. Having a discovery that is not accessible and is not affordable is not really going to have an impact on public health. And more attention to research to figure out how new healthcare delivery models can work with medical product developers that are trying to solve these problems, as you just heard, can work with payers, and there are many represented in this room who don't want to just pay for stuff, but want to pay for better care and lower costs. We need a lot more research there. Joe's group is helping with that, but we've got a lot of unanswered questions.
You talked about, thank you, sir, about problems. So let's move on to some of the challenges. And I open this up to the panel, so feel free to jump in and to follow up on your colleagues. What are the most daunting challenges in research, drug development, device development?
So I'll start down at this end. I put device development into 3 buckets. In many ways, it's public policy, right? The first is tax policy. The tax environment has to be right to incentivize companies to invest in research. And I could go into the details of the device tax and the structure of that and how it's taken money away from our companies that we were spending on research before, but that's probably for another conversation. The second is around the regulatory environment, and it's less about having a quick and speedy pathway and more about having a clear and transparent pathway through the FDA to get to approval. And that's what we've spent so much time working on. Mark, when he was the FDA commissioner, led a lot of that effort to improve it. Jeff Shuren, who's at CDRH now, for us, has done a great job in both speeding up that process and making it clearer for us so we know exactly what we're into when we start down the path. And then Scott, under his leadership, I think is going to add to that and do an even better job. The third piece is really payment policy. And that's one that many people don't really think about. Mark touched on it a little bit earlier. But clarity and transparency in the payment space, there's a lot to be gained there, right? We're not doing a great job in helping companies understand how to get the product through the FDA and then have Medicare, Medicaid, public payers, and even private payers reimburse for that. And it's not that we just want to get paid a lot of money for that. We just want to know how to get paid and what that price is so we can begin down that pathway.
Or you don't mind getting paid a lot of money, though.
We'll take that too. Okay. But what you hear from investors more than anything else is we understand the FDA process now. We have no idea what's going to happen once you get through FDA. And that's the piece I think we really need to figure out.
Yes, sir.
And that's the piece that Mark was talking about and that PCORI operates in, is that space. Once things become available, or at least arguably available because they've been improved, there are some hurdles. And one of them is, how do these new therapies compare with older therapies that were already there? How do they work in real-world populations? Are some patients going to respond differently than others? And that's what comparative effectiveness research, the kind of research that we fund, looks at. Most people in the room know that a good portion of our revenue set up in the Affordable Care Act actually comes from a fee on payers. No one else pays into supporting it. We see the payers' dilemma oftentimes that something gets approved and then it gets, that's predictably fairly costly, and they don't really know how it compares to what they've been paying for before. They know it maybe costs 2 or 3 times more. They do not know who's going to benefit. They know that not everybody's going to benefit. So as Mark said, there is a tremendous amount of research needed, and it's shocking, and we need to learn it in real-world practices. That's why we set up the CoreNet, so that you can study in real-world practice how new therapies are working. We need closer partnerships with, I think, manufacturers, probably with the FDA, and with payers, with CMS, for example, to do it as effectively as possible. But a lot of questions need to be answered once approval has happened.
Please jump in.
Victor, Joe, thank you for your comments about comparative effectiveness. I think we need to be really clear and transparent about how that's done. I think the CoreNet does a wonderful job of putting that into the practice, but also there are organizations looking at development of value principles that don't necessarily take the patient perspective in mind. So I think, as Scott was saying, the big issues about access. The drugs, the devices, the therapies, the technology can be as great as it can possibly be, but without access to it, it doesn't help for anyone. So I think the working together with PCORI and PCORNet, with all of the stakeholders, I think will help define that a little better.
I would agree with Scott's framework about those 3 big challenges, but I would like us to spend a little time talking about how we can overcome them, right? So if you look at the first piece, to me, as I said earlier, the cost and time is extraordinary. And to the extent that it's taking too long for a discovery or drug to be eventually approved or get through the clinical trial. And there are really many things that we can be doing now to make it faster. And we can talk about that perhaps later. But I also think that the issue of payers, I think we also have to understand the elephant in the room, which is how do you actually look at the price of drugs? So how do you actually transparently figure out what you're likely to be paid and why you're likely to be paid? These things have to really address. Otherwise, I think we can't afford all those therapies that's coming down this way. So I do think that these are the fundamental issues, and each one of them can be addressed in one way or the other. So for example, on the first one, certainly I was going to tell you that if you look at the ability to integrate a clinical research project into a clinical practice database and have an exchangeable, harmonized information system across different research sites, you move a lot faster. In Sweden, you may or may not have heard of this study called TASTE, published in New England Journal 2015. They have a national electronic record. They have a standard way of collecting the information. And so their question was, for an acute MI, patient comes in, does removal of thrombus before he puts stent make any difference? Well, in a 14-month period, they were able to enroll, they found 10,000 eligible patients because the database is all coming in common ways. 7,000 they were able to enroll. Our record, 5% in US of eligible patients are enrolled. Huge difference because you have an efficient system. Then those patients will get a standard of care. They can randomize. So at the end, the cost of that study was $350,000, $50 a patient, incremental. In our country, it will be a 3 to 5 year study, $15, $20 million. I think there are some fundamental things we got to change. That's what I'm trying to make the first point.
And can I add on to that, Victor? It's such an important point, and that's why at the American Heart Association 2 years ago, we formed a strategic relationship with Amazon, and we actually have created what I would say is a state-of-the-art data discovery marketplace. And since the moment we announced it in November until until it was, tested this spring and launched officially in July, we have 39 million patient records in this data infrastructure in about a 6-month time period. And these are data from observational studies. They're the data from worldwide stroke and atrial fibrillation consortia. They're health system data, and we're continuing to get additional data in. We've created 84 analytical tools. Well, we haven't. Amazon has created 84 analytical tools, and there's sandboxes off to the side that will allow this collaboration to happen with custom clinical studies just like that. And so this infrastructure has been developed. We are at the giving robust research grants to utilize the data, and we look forward to this data infrastructure contributing to answering a lot of these questions and speeding time to market.
Development of these kinds of infrastructure are critical, and it highlights the two sides that need to change. Scott appropriately emphasized predictability and hopefully rationality in the public policies that affect the development and use of new treatments. I would also like to emphasize the need for companies and people on the private side to do things differently. There are a lot of product developers in this room, health plans, consumer groups that are working with us in our program at Duke on implementing some of these new, much more person-focused models for paying for treatments. And a step in that direction is things like drug or device payments being tied to the results that matter for patients. And as you heard, we're just in very early stages of those kinds of arrangements now where lots of times what really matters to patients isn't captured. I think that's not only because of maybe obstacles to understanding and wanting to focus on what matters to patients. It's also just because of practical obstacles. Without infrastructure like what Nancy was just describing, it is not possible to know reliably whether a drug or a device is really affecting the outcomes that matter to patients over time. And there is not going to be a company-by-company specific solution for that. We've seen that not work on the provider side in payment reform efforts. It won't work on the medical innovation side either. So that means going along with the steps on the public policy side is much more of a need for collaborative research and collaborative infrastructure that's shared. You know, if we're trying to solve a problem with heart disease or any other condition, that is not a company-specific problem. That is a society-wide problem where we ought to find more common ground steps we can take to reduce the costs and make it easier to really learn what's working. But CoreNet, your efforts, these are all first steps in that direction, but we have a long way to go to make these products much more widely available at a lower cost.
So if I could just
Please.
add one thing. Building on what Mark and others have said, that the simple suggestion that I'd have is that we find ways to get started earlier in the process so that if one knows that a product is going to be approved, it's looking good, you are sitting down with payers. Hopefully you've sat down with them even before that, but manufacturers are sitting down with payers and with funders of comparative effectiveness research and planning the studies, hopefully short, rapid in CoreNet and other infrastructures, so that it does become more transparent what it takes, and what it takes is this matters for patients, this works differently than others, and these are the patients who benefit. Those kinds of questions, if answered on the day of approval, and they aren't because that's not part of FDA's mandate in terms of approval, but if we're beginning to answer those questions earlier on, we'll get to the solution to the coverage question much sooner.
All of you care deeply about healthcare. It's your life's work, as for people in our audience. But many of you represent different lanes. What are your tensions, and how do you? What are your strategies for managing those tensions? Right, because sometimes I would imagine your interests are different.
One tension I would just mention, I don't know that it's a tension, but it's another elephant in the room. You know, I haven't heard anyone yet today talk about people who aren't in a system. And, you know, if we look at, for example, it was referenced earlier by our colleague from CDC, the unfortunate uptick in deaths from stroke. And you peel back that data, it is African American and Hispanic Americans who have driven that number up. And it looks like the entire population has increased in terms of deaths from stroke. The same thing is happening with heart disease deaths. For 40 consecutive years, deaths from heart disease declined until 2 years ago. And now there's this uptick related to type 2 diabetes, related to obesity, related to all of these things that are impacting lifestyle, but there is a disproportionate effect in certain populations, and we have to be willing to step up to solve those problems too.
I think it's aligning incentives. And by this, I'm not being critical of anybody, except different entities have different incentives. And until we can get together and really understand common incentives, becomes a problem, right? So I think that's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. The other one, coupling with what Joe said, is very early we ought to talk about an economic analysis. You know, so many of the studies don't bother to talk about how much savings in terms of comparative effectiveness, how much would it cost to develop this, and how do we arrive at a rational way of payment, right? So both in terms of drug pricing and payment needs to be addressed as part of a clinical trial. Whether you collect that data in terms of economic data or use an economic modeling, at least to make the case, and you can follow that in post-market surveillance follow-up to see whether you realize those kinds of economic and cost-effective savings. To me, I think developing any new device or drug has to be cost-effective, the same idea what Joe is saying. It's just not, it can do the job. It's got to be doing better than what we have. And it's got to be, even could be more expensive, but it's better. It's cost effectiveness that's really important.
So the value discussion is a place where folks are trying to find common ground. Everybody can agree that something should be valuable to patients. Now, it's absolutely true that in order to calculate value, you have to understand what patients value and how these different treatments affect that. So that's a part of the mix there, that we need these kinds of studies that look at a wide range of outcomes. We had met with a group of people with multiple sclerosis about 3 years ago. It was a very dramatic meeting. They are not suffering from a shortage of medications right now. They say, we have 14 medications that will treat our disease, 14 expensive biologics that will treat our disease. We all know, because the FDA requires that they show to get approved, that they change the findings on CT scans. So the CT scans or the MRIs look better. Great. That the frequency of recurrences is shortened by the drug. So, they have relapses at a certain point in multiple sclerosis for years. And so, got to shorten the frequency of those relapses. And that some measure of global functioning is improved by these agents. And then you get approved. But they say, we've got pain, we've got fatigue, we've got a fuzzy mind, we're not thinking well, we've got imbalance. There is no evidence, because it wasn't collected, it wasn't part of the approval process. There's nothing that tells us whether one of these drugs is better than another in terms of fatigue or fuzzy-mindedness or imbalance. So we're now funding a very large portfolio that gets at how do these drugs do and how do different treatment regimens do in terms of, guess what, patient-reported outcomes. Same in the pain arena. All of those studies have patient-reported outcomes, but capturing those is part of calculating value. Sometimes when you actually get those outcomes, you really don't even need to go through the formality of the value calculation any longer.
Comment, just using
Please,
your swim lane analogy, your lane analogy. I think that one of the challenges that those that swim in those lanes go into the pool, that water is circulating all around, and we swim for the day and we go back to our lane at the end of the day, right? So we have shareholders, we've got other things that we need to pay attention to. I think what you need to do is take the lanes out and free swim it and let let people continue the engagement. I think there's progress being made. I think Dr. Gottlieb spoke about some of the things that were going on between the FDA and CMS and private payers and what Novartis just launched in a CAR T therapy. There's interesting new things where there's relationships with commercial payers to pass valuable savings along to patients so they don't have out-of-pocket expenses. We have challenges, and these are the things that I think we can do as a, in a free swim situation, is to try to get that applied to, government insurance as well.
So I was going to add, there are a lot of tensions that exist in the healthcare system. Clearly, an innovator and a payer, there's a natural tension that exists there. An innovator and a regulator, a natural tension that exists there, and a healthy one, I would add. But there's one thing at the center of all those that pulls us all together, and that's the patient.
That's right.
And oftentimes, and I'll speak from the government's perspective, oftentimes it feels like that government policy is budget-centric and not patient-centric. And I think if you think about it that way, I know that's a broad statement, but it's an important statement, and you think about policies that might be more patient-focused than budget-focused, you might get to better solutions. Let me give you an example. Victor said, well, let's not complain, let's look for ways to improve the system, and I think that's exactly right. There's a proposal that went through 21st Century Cures that was breakthrough pathways at FDA for, in our case, devices to get more quickly through with more transparency through the FDA, right? But the roadblock you still hit is at CMS. So we had a proposal that we're working on right now, which is breakthrough pathway on the payment side, which would be if you meet the test for a breakthrough product at FDA, once you clear the FDA hurdle, then have CMS give you a temporary code. At that point, you can begin the process, as Mark talked about, of building the evidence, right? We're not asking for a specific dollar amount. We're asking for access to the market so that we can build the evidence as to whether it works and what's cost effective. Been met with crickets so far, but I think it's a good idea. It's ideas like that that are a little more patient-centric that might help incentivize less tension and more patient-focused to what we do.
I'd like to open up to the questions from the audience. If you could please raise your hand. We have mics in the room. If you can please stand and give us your name and organization, please.
I'm Joe Hedrick with Janssen Research and Development. And as we've talked about what the patient values, often, as we all know, that's very difficult to assign an economic value to, or sometimes that economic value is not realized in the near term. So if I'm a private insurer and I know that this person is only likely to be in my plan for 3 years, what's my incentive to pay for a medicine that economic value occurs 20 or 30 years down the line? And I'd just like to hear from the panel, are there ideas to solve that as a problem? Because the patient perceives the value, there's economic value that could be years down the line, but nobody's willing to pay for that right now. So they wait until they get there, and then they pay for expensive secondary complications of diabetes or something like that. That seems like a pretty crazy way to be operating.
Please.
Well, I'll just say, to the extent that that's still an argument that is given, I think it's really sad. I mean, there's a cynicism about it that is just unavoidable. I think a lot of payers have gotten beyond that, and they understand that they're, that they're in a society, they're in a population, in a country, and they have a responsibility. But I can't disagree with you that it has been said many times, and it may take, sometimes it takes policy to change that attitude.
Yeah, I want to say something about this too, but let me first back up a second and talk about patients and costs. And I think in terms of another elephant in the room, it is going to be very hard to continue making progress, building on the 21st Century Cures opportunities, the preclinical announcements that Scott just made, if we don't do a much better job of using these and all other medical treatments efficiently in practice. If you think about what really concerns patients these days, it's not just getting access to the treatment if you have MS, but you pretty much know you're going to be out thousands of dollars each year, even if you get the treatments that are covered. Why? Not necessarily because payers don't want to pay for anything, but just look at the cost numbers now. So my former agency, CMS, has an expected budget this year of over $1 trillion, compared to the debate that we're having about a couple of $1 billion increases in funding for NIH and $500 million or a few billion for the opioid crisis. I mean, CMS spends that kind of money in less than a day. So if we don't do a better job of addressing the use of these technologies in practice, it's going to be really hard to pay attention and put appropriate effort into some of these things that really matter for patients. Just to put that in perspective too, and I agree, this argument shouldn't really hold weight. And again, I don't think it really does. If you look outside the U.S. at countries like Sweden and elsewhere, where the same people are in the same government-run programs for their entire lives, the prices are actually much lower than they are in the U.S. because there are these real concerns about overall budget constraints. So I think if we want to have real innovation in this country, the kinds of things that we're talking about here, it's going to take a much better effort to change the way that we deliver medical care. So we're spending hopefully more on these breakthrough therapies, but to make that sustainable, we got to spend less on the Victor and I led a report recently that the National Academy of Medicine put out on vital directions, which remind us again, 30–40% of healthcare spending is probably not contributing much, if anything, to outcomes that patients value, and a lot of it is actually harmful. That may be viewed as something that's kind of outside the purview of people who are developing these new treatments, but again, you're going right in. We're talking about alignment about what matters for patients. What matters for patients is not just their outcomes, but the total cost of what they're having to pay. So that's got to be part of the solution too.
Mark, you mentioned the 21st Century Cures Act. Where does that stand now from y'all's perspective? I mean, it was presented by one administration. Some see it being viewed differently by the current administration.
Bipartisanship is alive and well, right? This is, I don't have a long answer to that, but I think FDA is doing a great job of starting to implement that program, and it does two things. Two main things. I think one is gives FDA a lot more authority and needed resources to develop new kinds of treatments, precision medicine, data from patients, these kind of new clinical trial models and real-world evidence systems that Scott talked about earlier. But the second thing it does, it really encourages a lot more of a collaborative, I don't know if I'm going to use free swimming, but you know, kind of swimming to synchronize maybe, but the public and private sectors working together to solve some of the problems we've been talking about today. So I think those are really good steps.
Question? Yes, sir.
My name is Alberto Ruiz. I'm Vice President of the University of Maryland and Dean of the School of Medicine. I felt a little sensitive from the last panel regarding the responsibility of physicians for the opioid crisis, so I just want to make one comment and then ask a question. One is that at least at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, we make sure that every year in medical school, every year, the students are educated on opioid addiction, prevention, and the biological complications. So let me get it off my chest. I want to say, first of all, a terrific panel just now we had all morning. But there's one thing that I want to comment on, and Victor made the comment regarding the expensive nature of producing a drug, and also the time it takes from discovery, bench discovery, to actual patient care. And that is certainly well acknowledged. And when I give the talk, I usually use from Brown and Goldstein's Nobel Prize to the formation of statin and how many years it took. And that was one of the faster drugs to be produced. But one thing that we haven't covered yet so far that I'd like to ask you to make a comment on, and that is the whole idea of recognizing there are many, many drugs that have been approved by FDA. And those drugs some of them have failed in clinical trials. And it would be worthwhile, in fact, I think it's a great idea, to repurpose those drugs, because in that case, you actually circumvent going through the whole process. At my institution, I really encourage, once a discovery is made, try to find molecular characterization of the molecule and try to find a drug that resembles that molecule. So as opposed to creating your new drug, a drug is already on the market, it's already approved by the FDA. You're simply going to have to repurpose the drug. My question to you is, how do you see that fitting into the landscape, Victor, and being able to at least shorten the time frame from a discovery to patient use?
Well, as you know, Al, there's a lot of interest and activity in repurposing drugs. I thought you were also going to mention precision medicine, because really when drugs fail and you don't pay attention to the specific, whether it's genotype or phenotype of that particular patient, the well-known drug in terms of for lung cancer, EGF receptor, where you can really relook at their genetic profile and then find that it actually works in a smaller population and effectively. So I think there's a huge possibility for repurposing. Points well taken.
I might add to that as well. We have a really great research program. The American Heart Association, Google's life science company Verily, and AstraZeneca have funded to the tune of $75 million, one investigator and a team of people. And part of the work that group is doing based out of the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston is exactly looking at this topic of drug repurposing and using the high computing capabilities that are available to us through this collaboration, the available, the molecular library, but as well as the drug library. So we're working.
I wish
on
it
that
were
as well.
much more promoted and much more. It's available, but somehow, or investigators, or even the public, it's just not highly promoted and highly visible and highly recognized. It's certainly a way to go, but it's really underappreciated.
From the biopharmaceutical sector, this is happening daily, and it's not well publicized. I think the biologic sciences and the genomic sciences are catching up to the pharmaceutical sciences, and that you won't be treating diseases any longer, you'll be treating genetic and other molecular pathways. And it's happening. There are examples where there's drugs on the market for oncology that immediately go into multiple sclerosis. And so there's examples there. I think we need to look closer.
We have time for a few more questions, and we can make the questions as tight as possible, so we get as many questions as we can. Yes, Manette.
Hi, yeah, I appreciated Nancy Cavalier. I appreciated Joe's comment about sitting down with payers earlier in the process, but I wondered how constrained drug and device developers feel by rules around pre-approval communications, FDAMA 114, and how do you balance communicating value and cost effectiveness when you have some of those rules in place?
So it is really tricky. I'll tell you what we're doing right now on the federal level is we've been engaged with the HHS Office of Inspector General to try to get a better understanding of how that process should work. There may be some safe harbor rules and regulations that you can put in place to allow that communication to go forward. If it's done under the best intentions, which it would be, I think, speaking from device and drug companies both, it can work really well. But it is an impediment right now. And honestly, it's hard to get over that without some changes into either federal statute or regulation.
Question from this side of the room. Please, sir.
Yeah,
Okay, speak up loud.
yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
can speak loudly. I never have a problem.
Kind of.
Your name.
A little softer.
I'm Jay Siegel, Johnson & Johnson. I wanted to follow up on repurposing because I agree that the opportunities are extensive. And I certainly agree that when you look at drugs as influencing pathways, you know, as we did, for example, with Remicade, we found 16 different indications for their drug. There are limitations, though, especially in the IP space. And what we find on a regular basis is that we have a drug that we realize a new use for an important disease. And we can explore that use simply by investing $250 million, at the end of which time there will be generic competitions and we will never recoup anything close to the investment or biosimilar competition. So I know that some work has been done in terms of IP in that space, and yet still there's so much more in terms of innovation that could be done. And so the question is, should we as a group supporting innovative research be looking to better IP protection for that sort of repurposing?
The answer is yes. The question is, the people who have to make that decision and have that debate usually do it in a public forum. And all of a sudden it gets away from an actual conversation about IP protection for the patient that you're trying to serve and to a political conversation about the cost of drugs and its impact on society. Now, once you get into that conversation, it kind of ends, right? So, but if somehow you can have a public dialogue where people are having honest conversations about the value of intellectual property to our system, then maybe you can get there. Until then, it's going to be just frankly really hard, Jay, to have an honest conversation about it.
As we run out of time, if we could have closing thoughts from each of you. And Mark, I'm sorry, Victor, I want to start with you. You mentioned the word innovation earlier. And so in your closing remarks, if you could talk about something that you're excited about, that you see as part of the future that could potentially be a game changer.
Well, I think there's certainly a lot of discussion on the use of data that we can collect now through different ways, wearables, electronic health record, many others. And I'm excited about that because I think it gives you a lot more data that's useful, hopefully, and that if you can share it, it'll be very powerful. And that if one can develop analytics, as we said earlier, then I think we can really transform the way by which we can do our clinical research and move things much faster. I'm thinking that even if you use innovation technology as a way to look at patient recruitment, in Scotland, there's a program called SHARE where they are actually looking at every patient that comes to the system is registered, and automatically they consent to being searched online anonymously for any condition that they have. And if there's a match with a potential trial, they'll be de-identified, contacted, and they can opt out. So now you can save a lot more time. So I think if you look at technology innovation, innovative doing things, I'm on the bandwagon that we got to think about these kind of things in order to move things forward. If not, then you'll be coming to same old, clinical sites, a protocol at a time, each group IRB at a time, and and trying to look at data analytics at a time, and it's just not good. So I'm excited about the data and the innovative ways of using it.
Scott, we'll go with you, and then down the line, about 30 seconds.
My industry is on the front edge of cutting innovation. I've got on my watch, which just happened to remind me, a sensor that connects to my daughter's blood glucose monitor. It's a continuous glucose monitor. We used to prick her fingers 8 to 10 times a day to draw blood so she could check her blood sugar. She's type 1 diabetic. Today she wears this monitor. It sends a signal by Bluetooth to my phone to let me know if she's high or low. That's innovation. It changes the way patients live, and it has a positive impact on long-term outcomes. And if we embrace that technology and aren't afraid of it, it will be much better in the long term. I'd go about 10 more items of amazing innovations in our space, but that's just one.
Thank you, sir. Please, 30 seconds if you will.
I think the data world, we're creating data lakes and data oceans, and I think, Victor, you said it nicely, is that we need better analytics tools or better fishing poles seem to be going down the water pathway.
You're like swimming, yeah, exactly.
But I do think, I think data is an important piece, but I think the patient-focused element is a critical one. I think there's a lot of focus on including that patient voice. I think the patient-focused drug development efforts that the FDA has underway. I think the European regulations that are being put into place in 2018 to make sure that patient voice is included. I think we can make innovative trials that are friendly to patients to encourage them to join in a clinical trial and stay in it.
Nancy, thank you, sir.
I would just add to all of the discussion on technology, I think it's inspiring all of the companies that are not traditional healthcare companies that care a lot about helping to solve these problems. Everyone in this room needs to help those companies understand what the problems are, understand the basics of the, how clinical care happens, how patient prevention happens, and how science happens. And I think we can see magical things in the years to come.
Yeah, not even magical, but reality of healthcare and health that's really focused on intervening or intercepting diseases or preventing them before they happen. Care that's much more prevention focused and that people can get at home, like Scott was just describing. I don't want to underestimate the hard work, though, to get from here to there. It means everybody not just talking the talk, but really walking the walk of getting to value and putting patients at the center. And it means letting go and trying hard with new kinds of research on how to do this. It's, we have a long way to go to get there, and this group can make a big difference in making it happen.
Joe, 30 seconds, please, sir.
Number one, patients. Patients have blown my mind, all of our minds, I think, in the last 5-10 years, the ways that they've refocused us on the right outcomes and the right research questions, making for research that I think will move faster through the pipeline because everybody agrees that it's needed. Number two, big clinical research networks like PCORNet, Sentinel, the convergence, a single national resource that brings the systems, the clinicians, the patients, the payers, very importantly the payers, and ultimately the sponsors of research, including industry, together to discuss what's worth doing.
Thank each of you. Please thank our panelists and thank all of you.
Great to work with you. Thank you. Good to see you.